welcome to Life Hacks with Mac. I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce you to a phenomenal person that I'm looking forward to interviewing, Gary Italiaander, who has a background and a story that is fascinating. And I'm really looking forward to delving into some of the detail and sharing that with everybody today. So, Gary, welcome to Life Hacks with Mac. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. I look forward to picking your brains and finding out about the things that you're going to share with us. And I know you were going to give us some advice on things like image development for your business, as well as creating images and all things image. But there's a lot more to the story than just that. So I'm looking forward to going into that. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. So just before I start asking you questions, Gary, I want to quickly just give everybody an overview. So, Gary is a world-renowned photographer whose background stretches from the UK internationally. He is an educator, a musician, author, and sought after guest speaker as well. And after today, you'll know why. He has had the musical talents and the natural knack, as well as educated musical background, where from a very young age he was able to play and learn to play the harmonica as well as the piano. Went off to go and study at the London College of Music under the world-renowned Dr. W.S. Lloyd Webber, which is a phenomenal accolade in itself. And we'll delve into that a little bit more later, because there are some interesting twists to Gary's life from his music world that then went on to a total change of direction into the phenomenal world of photography, where he has been able to capture images that, if you look at his collection, blow your mind, because, as they say, a picture tells 1,000 words. How does that saying go, Gary?
Exactly that. Yeah.
So I got that right. It sounded very strange coming out of my mouth. And with that background in photography, Gary has also been the photographer of choice, or the portrait photographer for Harrods, which everybody knows the name, and has set up, and he was commissioned and invited to come to Harrods to set up the Italiaander portrait studio, which is a phenomenal story that I'd love to delve in and ask a few more questions, because I'm sure he's met some fascinating people in his time over there. And that then changed to leaving Harrods to go and work internationally and abroad on some phenomenal photographic projects that I'm sure you'll share with us today. A few of those, Gary?
Yeah, with pleasure.
Excellent. And then, one of the things, when I heard this the first time, I thought, okay, now having lived in the UK for 20 years, the fact that Gary has been, firstly, he's widely published on a subject that I'll come to in a second, but also tested photographic paper. Now, when I first heard that, I thought, okay, tested photographic paper. And then I heard Ilford, and me being or having worked in Ilford or close to and around Ilford for a while, didn't think much of the two until I put two and two together about my photographic background going back many years, and I realized it was the world-renowned Ilford brand, and Gary's images, if I'm correct, have appeared on their branding and packaging internationally. So that in itself is another massive accolade, and then as well as being representing Olympus cameras as well, so another big brand name, and it just kind of sounds like there's almost nothing that Gary can't do. So I'm really looking forward to going into this conversation, and then later on getting into the book that you wrote, which is The Reflections, a tribute to Larry Adler, the harmonica genius. And I'm excited to uncover the as I thought about it, the full circle of life, because it literally gives me goosebumps when I when I think about how you started off with the harmonica as an instrument of choice growing up, and then that connection later on and becoming that personal friend with Larry Adler himself.
Yes.
And that's just a beautiful full circle that many would, I'm sure, go to lengths to have even met the man. Never mind being friends with him. So it's almost like I don't know where to start, because there's so many beautiful things to go into and discuss. But I'd like to start off at the early days, if that's okay, Gary.
Sure.
And really understand the journey, so that people can connect the dots and then understand why you're somebody that people are reaching out to invite to come and speak with large organizations, the books that you're writing, and another book that's on its way, and just so that they can get a little flavor of what I've experienced so far. So tell us about the early days, if that's okay, and how you connected harmonica, piano, and
with pleasure. So I think what's quite interesting for me is that when I started out, I actually have an approach to life, which is that you mentioned this in a way, but everything's possible. I don't take a view that things are not achievable. They may be complicated to achieve, but there's a route. There's a way to get to most things that you want to get to. And I don't know whether this had any relevance, but when I was 3, I was very ill and I was in hospital for a year. And apparently the fact that I'm still here is something which is quite odd in a way. And that might have something to do with my determination, the fact that I have a determined character. And to be honest with you, until I was about 8 or 9, I actually don't really remember those years before that. And it may well be that being in hospital for a year, that actually it's something, whatever happened then, I don't want to remember, which is fine. But my story really starts at the age of about 6, when I was visiting with my parents and my sister, a cousin. And the cousin suddenly handed this 6-year-old child a harmonica, a mouth organ as it's sometimes referred to, and said, nobody plays this and nobody is interested in it. But if you want, it's almost like a toy. If you want it, you can have it. And the story goes, and I have no recollection of this, but the story goes that I actually picked the harmonica up and I was able to get a recognizable tune out of it straight away. And I very, very quickly became completely enchanted by this instrument, because I found it was something which was just became very important to me. And obviously I had a musical ability that nobody else in the family had. It wasn't as if I had other relatives that sang or played music or whatever. There was nobody else that did that.
So no other musical influence whatsoever?
No, we didn't have any of that. And nobody was interested in the family, particularly that I was aware of, in classical music. But this was something very special to me immediately. And so between the age of 6 and 9, I would play the harmonica. I wouldn't go anywhere without a harmonica. In fact, I wouldn't even go to bed without the harmonica. It was with me all the time. And eventually, at the age of 9, my headmaster of my school, who was a musician, called my parents into the school and said, you've got a child here who has musical ability. You should be doing something with it. You need to be aware of it. And so the result of that was I started having piano lessons, because that was kind of the standard route musically. And then the harmonica kind of took a back seat, and then it just disappeared from me touching it. So by the age of about 12, I'd been given a place at the London College of Music as what they called in those days, and I don't know if they still use the term, a junior exhibitioner. What that meant was that one day a week on a Saturday morning, I would go for 4 hours to the college. I would have music lessons of history of music, piano, various other things, and that was all paid for by a scholarship, and that was my music education for the next 3 years. So every Saturday I would go to in term time, I'd go to the college and I'd have my music lessons, and the harmonica really took a total back seat. Now, one thing that did happen around the age of 9, which is quite a funny story, is that my father, and in fact I can lay my hands on it because it's here. My father had been at work, and I had been out with my mother to a place called Ealing, part of London, and there was a very well-known music shop in Ealing called Squire's. And Squire's was a big music shop selling everything under the sun. And as we walked past the shop, I see in the window a harmonica, but a really special one. And on the side of the harmonica, it says Larry Adler. Now, I already knew the name Larry Adler because I'd heard about him. But I see this name Larry Adler, and I saw this, and I was jumping up and down with joy that there was this harmonica. That evening, my father comes in from work, and he says, how's your day been? And I start jumping up and down and telling him about this amazing harmonica. And he says to me, what would you do to own that harmonica? And I said, I'd do anything. And he said, such as? He said, would you get down on your hands and knees and kiss the floor? And I said, of course I would. And he said, show me. And much to my amazement and completely unknown, I didn't know this, in his pocket, he had seen that harmonica that day and he'd bought it in London. And he had it in his pocket. So when I stood up, on the table, on a plate with nothing else on it, sat this harmonica. Now, I'm going back a long time ago, and funnily enough, here, I actually have that actual harmonica, which I don't play anymore. It doesn't, after all those years, it doesn't really work very well. But there's the actual harmonica, and I think you might see, if I turn it around the right way, you'll see on the side the name Larry Adler printed on it.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, just about to make that out. I think it's on both sides. Yeah, it's called the Larry Adler Professional 16. It was actually quite a big harmonica, and I don't play that size harmonica now. I play one that's a bit smaller because it's actually what Larry played was a 12 rather than a 16, and it's much more comfortable to play and so on and so forth. So that's how I then got more involved with the music. And then at the age of 15, so I'd been at the London College of Music for 3 years, my parents made an enormous decision that we would move to America for what was hoped to be a better life. And we moved to Atlanta in Georgia. And I continued with my piano lessons, only on an individual basis, but the lessons actually took place at a place called Emory University, which is a very famous American university. In fact, it's the university where the moon rocks went after the first moon landing. And it's a very, very famous scientific university for all sorts of things. So, but that's where, and they had a music department, and that's where I went for my piano lessons. And then after 2 years, we came back to England. And then I went back to the London College of Music to say I want to continue with my music education. That's when I had my audition with Dr. Lloyd Webber. And he heard me play the piano. He was just in the room with me and said, we'd like to offer you a place here on the full-time music course. And funnily enough, I did a course which was known as the Performers course. So the idea was that if you did the Performers course, you was kind of heading to be a performer. And at that time of my life, when I was between 18 and 21, I didn't really have the notion to be a performer. I wasn't outgoing at all. The idea of sitting on a platform and performing and then traveling the world or whatever else really was not where I was heading. It took many, many years for me to realize that actually that was something I did want to do, but not with the piano. So I had this very strange situation. I did my 3 years. I then went to Reading University as well and did a year in teachers training, but specializing in music. And then I became a qualified music. I was already a piano teacher, but then I became a music teacher to allow me to teach specialist subjects of music in school. And so that took me through to sort of my mid-20s, which was about the time I'd already discovered photography and was beginning to get very excited about photography. And at that time, I was becoming quite disillusioned with the idea of spending the rest of my life teaching. So it wasn't that I'd fallen out of love with music, but I realized that teaching wasn't for me.
And this was after you'd already returned to the UK?
Yeah. So I came back to the UK when I was 17. From 18 to 21, I was at music college, had a couple of years teaching piano, then went to university when I was about 24, 25, did a year, which of course is less than a year's course, and then got a job teaching in schools. And I did that for some time. But within that period, I was beginning to think, actually, this is not the route that I want to be on. And a couple of things that happened when I went to America, which were mind-blowing to say the least. So 1968, walking into an American high school for the very first time, with my father, meeting the principal of the school, the head of the school, and he said to me, "You do realize that you will have to study American history." Well, I don't remember this conversation, but my father says, and what you answered was, "That's fine, that won't take long."
Oh, no!
Which I don't know how that went down.
That must have gone down like a lead balloon.
Absolutely, probably did. And then the next thing was the same day when they tried to position me within the school, because the structure of American teaching and education was totally different and behind what we had in the UK, particularly in the south of the southern states. The other thing they told me at that point was that I had to join some group, and when I said, "I've never heard of, what is this? I've never heard of it." I was 15, never heard of this group, and they said, "Well, when you go to Vietnam, you'll go as an officer." And I hadn't heard of Vietnam, and I said, "What's Vietnam?" And they said, "Well, we've got a war going on in Vietnam." And I was horrified. I said, "Well, I'm not. I'm not going to Vietnam." And actually, I wouldn't have gone to Vietnam because I was an American citizen anyway. But I didn't know that. I didn't know that I couldn't possibly be sent off to Vietnam. And they said, "Well, if you're not going to do that, you'll have to do PE." And I said, "Yeah, okay, fine." So it was a very, and this was the first day of being in an American high school. Within probably a couple of hours of being there, and I suddenly had all this presented to me. So that was quite strange. And I must say that when I came back to the UK and I stepped out of that, I realised that the USA was not for me. But so that takes us through to the point where I started to look at the photographic opportunities of work, and at the same time, the harmonica now was completely out of the picture.
I was just going to ask.
Yeah, didn't play it at all. Yeah.
And was that a conscious choice, or was it just something that kind of drifted?
Just drifted. I think the piano became so important, and also in those days I was doing hours of piano practice every day, and I was obviously occasionally I would have to play in a public situation, but it wasn't my choice to earn my living doing that then, and I'm pretty sure I wasn't good enough, because the quality of performers who are around the world who are fantastic and can't make a living doing it, it never, it was just not the route I wanted to go. And when I started to realize that teaching was the only option, and actually I didn't really want to be doing that, because that wasn't really where I set out to be. And the funny thing is that if I go back to when I was about 7 or 8, we had a knock on the door one day, and a lady was standing there, and she said, "I'm doing some research on the BBC about radio programs and music," and she said, "with children." And she said, "What do you listen to?" And I said, "Well, I listen to Radio 3, the classical music on Radio 3. And she said,
she must have been quite surprised.
She was more than surprised. She said to me, Radio 3 doesn't, we don't have classical music on Radio 3. And I said, "Of course you do." She didn't even know, because she was interviewing children, and none of the children she was interviewing listened to classical music. And it was only when I was insistent that there was that she actually went through her notes and then looked at the notes and went, "Oh yes, there is classical music," because it was unusual. And so throughout my life, from the age of 6, when I started to take an interest in music, it's been a complete open range of music. So I love classical music, but I love all sorts of other music as well. I like certain pop music, not everything, like with classical music. You don't, because you like classical music doesn't mean you like all classical music. You like a selection, and the same with other types. I like jazz. I don't tend to listen to masses of it, but I like jazz. People like Oscar Peterson, who of course was a great jazz pianist, and so on and so forth. So music itself, from the earlier stage, has remained with me as being very, very important to me. Yeah, absolutely.
So, what was the moment you realized that photography was something that was of interest? That what was the thing that tweaked that you went? I want to be doing that.
I can pinpoint that. Actually, it happened in quite an odd way, or an unusual way. I was going away with some friends for a week's holiday, and I didn't have a camera. And in those days, there weren't phones with cameras, and you had to have a camera to be taking photographs. And my father had a camera, which was quite a reasonable camera. And he lent it to me for the week, and I went away with this camera. In those days, of course, it was film, 35mm, 36 pictures on a roll. And at the end of the week, I came back with my roll of film. I went to the chemist, which was the procedure in those days to get things processed. And I walked in and said, "Can you, print this for me?" And then a week or so later, I walked back in, wondering what I'd got, to be met by the chemist saying to me, "Are you a professional photographer?" And I was staggered by this question, because clearly I wasn't. This was my first roll of film. And he said, "Because your pictures are fantastic." And I hadn't seen them yet. And I was thinking, well, what have I done? What have I taken? And the pictures came out very well. And I obviously had an eye for, like I had an ear for the music, I had an eye for image. And I've seen through my life that I'm a very creative person. So there are a lot of things that that have come about because of those things. So that was really the point at which I can pinpoint and say that was the thing that opened my eyes to taking photographs. And at that time, soon after that, when I got a bit more interested in it, funnily enough, we had a family friend, somebody that my father worked with in the advertising world, who was a very well-known commercial photographer. And when he knew that I wanted to get my own camera, he took me to a place. They sold secondhand cameras in the building where he worked. And he said, "I'll introduce you to these people." I suppose, at that time I must have been 20ish or something. And he introduced me to these people, and he said, "This is a friend of mine, and he's looking for a camera." And they bought out a few cameras. And I said, "How good is the camera?" And the answer I got, which was a bit cheeky really, was, "Better than you'll probably ever get out of it." Right?
Wow.
Yeah. In other words, what they were trying to say to me is, it's a really good camera. Do everything you want it to do. And not knowing that I would go on to achieve what I've achieved photographically. But it was fine. It was a nice camera, and it did what I needed it to do. And at that time, I had friends who were in a financially better position than me, who would go out and buy all sorts of expensive cameras and lenses, and they'd walk around with bags that I couldn't even lift up. But they were more interested in the equipment that they were buying than the actual taking.
So they had the big lens, and they
had everything. And I had my camera with its lens. And as time went by, of course, I spent a little bit of money, and I had better cameras, but I was never in a position to just go out and spend some fortune on cameras. And then eventually I realized that the photography people were coming to me, in fact, and saying, "We've seen," because I took an interest in people. People started to be the area that I liked the most. And then people would see pictures and say, "Would you do some pictures of my children for me?" And of course, I'll pay you for that. And so a little business started. And then it got to the point where I thought, well, really, I need to make a decision, which, I'm teaching, but I'm also doing photography. And for a while I was doing both things, but eventually I reached a stage where I thought, no, I've got to really make a decision. And in 1986, I won what was known as a Kodak Gold Award. And that was a very, very prestigious thing to win. And when I won it, it was almost the catalyst really for me to go, okay, I need to move on now. And the way I did it, which was also very unusual, but it's part of the way that I am with what I do, is I decided to write to some well-known contacts, some well-known photographers, but some very well-known photographers,
I'm starting to see a pattern there.
and ask their advice and say, what do you think of what I do? And I won't mention names, but I won't mention the names that were negative. But I got a couple of letters back, which were one was fairly rude, a bit blunt. The other one was quite pleasant, but didn't help me at all. But the third letter which came back, which was really special, was from it was actually a phone call from no, sorry, it was a letter with a phone number for me to call, which was Patrick Litchfield, Lord Litchfield, who was the Queen's cousin.
Wow.
Say Lord Litchfield is very interested to meet you. Of course, I was blown away by that. And I was then invited to his studio, and I met him, and I took with me masses of photographs. And he looked through every single photograph that I took with. It was the end of his day. He was in his studio, which was actually a house in Chelsea, and sort of near Notting Hill, in fact. And he looked through all the pictures, and I was with him for about an hour, and he was very nice and very pleasant, and this was helpful to me to give me some idea of what I was doing. I met another photographer that invited me to a photographic professional group that met every month in their studios and said, you might find this interesting. And I've been a member of that group since 1984, I think now. And still participate in that group. There was a meeting last night online, which I was
Wow.
Of, yeah. And that was fantastic.
So networking through the decades.
Absolutely, and met lots of very well known, not like Litchfield, but still very well known photographers in their own areas, very competent photographers, and all portrait photographers, which was very much the area that I wanted to develop. And so, and then actually I started working on an exhibition of photographs. And about 18 months later, I called Litchfield Studios and said, I'd like to meet Lord Litchfield again. And I was invited back to the studio, and I took with me some of these portraits I'd done. And it was very interesting for me because I remember that first meeting, and I remember the second meeting. And at the second meeting, he didn't treat me like an amateur who was coming to show him some pictures. He treated me like a colleague, even to the point of asking what equipment I was using, because he was thinking of changing his camera. And I know that after that meeting, when he did change his camera, he changed to something very similar to what I was using.
And how long was this after the original meet?
About 18 months.
Wow.
Yeah, about 18 months.
Shows you what can happen in a short period of time.
Yes, and at that point, I'd photographed some very well-known people, and he was, and Litchfield was known for his celebrity portraits. So he was very taken with not only the quality that I'd produced, but who I'd photographed and how on earth did you get to these people. And that's a separate story, which I won't go into here. But it was, again, part of my process of, well, if you want to do something, then just get on and do it. And once I've made contact with a few people, one of them who was very significant was a very famous man called Lord Weidenfeld, the book publisher of a company called Weidenfeld and Nicholson. And I managed to make contact with Lord Weidenfeld. I photographed him. I then went back to his home a week later to show him the pictures, which he loved. And he said, who else are you photographing for your project? And he said, I'm going to put my office at your disposal. And my secretary will write to, and there were a whole load of significant people that then came to me, or I went, in fact, these were all location portraits, which is something I specialize in. I like photographing on location within people's own environments, because then their story becomes part of the portrait. And I've done a lot of work like that. And so that became something very special for me to do, yes.
And I know in a previous discussion with you, Gary, you have this natural knack of, when you say location photography, to almost take an individual in their own environment, take a photograph that then tells so many stories, but depicts the essence of that person in a single photograph. You know, is there a magic recipe, or is that just something that you've always just been able to?
I don't think there's a magic recipe. I think it comes down to that something that you have. You improve what you do by practicing it and doing it, but there's something that you have which is built in, which you can't, I don't believe, you learn. So when you take somebody who has look, if you take a Roger Federer as an example, as a tennis player, tennis being one of my passions, you take Roger Federer. Now, somebody who says, I'm going to take up tennis and I'm going to be as good as Roger Federer, they're not. And they're not because they won't work very hard to do it. And they might become a good tennis player. But there's something about an individual that happens through their period that they're doing what they're doing, which is extra. It's something special. And it's not then about the work that you do and the study that you do and the practice you do. There's something else that's in there. The Pavarotti, you don't wake up and say, I'd love to sing like Pavarotti. You can't, because it's an inbuilt, it's a God-given gift. And that's just there. You may improve it, you may change it and develop it, but you can't create the voice that you don't have.
So is that not much like, and I speak for myself here at the same time, if we're in search of trying to be somebody or something else, more often than not, we're always, as you've just put it, the bottom line is you're never going to hit the mark, because you're not trying to be yourself. You're trying to emulate somebody else who, because they're being themselves, have their own essence that can't be replicated. And because of the commitment to the art of whatever they are part of, it isn't something that can be replicated.
Well, I'd qualify it by saying that I wouldn't want it to be thought that I'm saying if you haven't got it, you haven't got it, because part of the issue with this is you don't know who's got it. When you see a child doing something and you think, wow, they're going to be brilliant, it may be that 10 years later you meet that person and they don't do it anymore because they lost interest. You don't know the one that's going to excel. So it's a very, very important feature. So if somebody loves doing something and keeps doing it, they might suddenly develop, they flower. And then you go, wow, I remember, when this child or this young person was doing something and I was impressed by what they're doing, but this is off the planet, because you don't know who's going to achieve those things. And of course, part of the issue with that is who wants to. We've got friends whose one of their daughters was a very accomplished tennis player at the age of 9. They moved to America because of her tennis abilities, and she did very, very well. But when she got to the age of about 16 or 17, she'd achieved all sorts of things, but not the level of being capable of playing at Wimbledon and ever winning a major tournament. And then she lost interest. So whatever she was capable of doing, you've got to put your heart and soul into making it happen if you want to do it. The very, very famous pianist Arthur Rubinstein, once in an interview, a woman was heard saying to him, "I'd give my life to play like you," and his answer was, "I did." Because that's what you have to do. You have to put everything into it, to be successful in anything. And there's no guarantees.
Yeah.
So it's a
dedication to the art.
It's a dedication. And it's not just that, and of course, it's not just with the arts, because, if you take someone like Bill Gates, you can say, look at how much. But when he started out as a geek, and he said, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, the fact that it took off and he made obviously an absolute fortune and developed an incredible company, there will be other people that were going down that road and didn't make a fortune and didn't develop an incredible company. It's just the way that things happen.
Sure. So you then had this beautiful twist of being invited to photograph at Harrods. How did that come about? And tell us a little bit about, because that must have been a fascinating story in itself.
Well, what happened, in fact, was that at the time I'd started. So now I'd started to work professionally. I was working. I've always worked up to that point from home. I was working from home, and I had a room in the house with a desk, and I wasn't doing any photography at my house. And then my wife and I decided that we'd build a studio in my garden. We had space to put a studio in the garden, a reasonable sized studio. So I then had an outside space to work out, and people could come to me, which they did. And at the same time, my father, who's a painter, very, very good painter, I said to him one day, it'd be interesting to do a photograph and a painting mixed together. And we created a combination of a thing that we called duet, because it was two art forms. And we invited some people to do duets with us. And one of the people was a well-known TV personality who I was friendly with, called Bob Holness. He had a program on television called Blockbusters. And I told Bob about this, and he said, that sounds very interesting. Yeah, I'd love to be involved in this. And we were going to create one of these duet artworks. And Bob had a story that he wanted to depict. And the idea was that I would photograph him, and then everything around him would become an oil painting depicting the story that he wanted to tell. And we did that, and we had a few samples like this, and somebody that I knew in business said, this is so unusual, maybe Harrods would be interested in what you're doing. So I wrote to Harrods, and then, things in life happen in the most peculiar ways. So my expectation is, I've written a letter to a very famous store, the most famous store in the world. My expectation is they're going to write back to me and say, thank you for writing to us, but we're not interested. And I get a letter in the post, and it says, thank you for writing to us, we're not interested. And I thought, well, that's what I expected. In the next post, the next morning, I received a second letter from Harrods from a different person saying, thank you for writing to us, we're very interested, which was completely bizarre. And so, rather like with the Litchfield thing, there was a phone number and a name, and I phoned and spoke to this gentleman, and he said, I'd like you to come along to Harrods to discuss what you've written to us about. And so my father and I went to Harrods, and we took a couple of these things with us to show. They were quite big artworks, and we took them to show. And when we were having the discussion, he suddenly looked at me and said, what we're really interested in is you coming here to be the photographer, to open a studio here. And that was something that very few people had ever had the privilege to do. And I knew of the previous photographer who hadn't been at Harrods for 8 years. So my father and I walked out of there bemused by what had happened. My father said, what do you make of all of that? And I said, wow, I was not expecting that request. Would you like to do this?
That's a slight move from the garden to Harrods.
Huge. And in fact, that gentleman and another gentleman came from Harrods. They were senior management to my garden to look at my setup before pursuing the idea that I might actually go to Harrods. And they were obviously happy with what they saw. They were obviously happy with me and my work. And they said, we're not talking to anybody else. This is not a discussion. We're not putting this out to tender. We're offering this to you. And my reaction was, I have to say yes, because this kind of an opportunity, I don't know where it's going to go, but these things, they only happen once in a lifetime. So it took a year to actually be able to go there, because finding the appropriate space, Harrods is a store that is actually, people are scrambling to get space in there. They had to create a suitable space, not a very big space, but it was a space where I had a gallery that I could show my work. And as time went by, we'd get phone calls. I had staff there, and people would phone up and say, I'm phoning from Saudi Arabia, and I'll be in London next week. I'd like to book my sitting. So people that didn't know me but knew that there was a photographer at Harrods and wanted that service would then come to me. They would call, and in some cases they'd ask me to go to their residences in the UK, normally within easy reach of London or in central London, or they'd come to my studio, which was in Primrose Hill, very close to the centre, and that worked very well. But Harrods wasn't the easiest place to run a business, without question, and I certainly won't say more than that. But after 4 years, I said, actually, I want the freedom to do more things that I want to do with what I'm doing, without the restrictions that I've got of this. And then the development was that some of my clients from abroad said, we'd like you to come over to, and the place I went to a number of times was Kuwait. And I went there to photograph members of the royal family, and other very prestigious families. And the strange thing that I discovered is that when you go to Kuwait, as a visitor, you don't, I think there are a number of countries like this, you don't get invited to people's homes. They're very hospitable, but they will entertain you in restaurants and hotels, but their home is a private place. But the unusual thing for me was I was going there to photograph them in their homes. That was, and I didn't even realize that this was, initially, I didn't realize that that was an unusual thing, because I met expats there, and when they realized what I was doing, they said, this is amazing that you're doing this. We never go to there. We've been living here for 3 years. We never go to anyone's homes. It's not the way they do things. So I was then going to these homes that were spectacular beyond belief.
And getting to see what nobody else does.
And getting to see what nobody else does, and photographing people in their own private places, which was fascinating. And that, of course, it led to more trips. Then I had the opportunity to go to Nigeria, because one of my clients was Nigerian and was opening an airline and wanted me to go to Nigeria to photograph the airline. And I don't know if you want me to show you a couple of photographs here that might just be
absolutely
interesting for people looking into this. So if I go into here,
there we go.
Yeah. So this was a very strange situation, and this is where being creative is something that I specialize in. I arrived in Nigeria, in Lagos, with a team of 2 video people, because the chairman of the company said to me, I'm opening an airline. I'd like you to come and photograph the party that we're having, the inaugural party, which is on a Sunday. You'll fly in on the Saturday. And I'd like you to bring video people with, because I want the video, the event as well. And I said, okay, fine. And we flew in on the Saturday, going to Nigeria. I mean, I could talk to you probably for 2 or 3 days about this trip. It was quite bizarre in many respects, but I'll leave that out of the story. We arrived in Nigeria, and I get to the airport with my colleagues. I meet the managing director. The chairman at that point is not arrived. I meet the managing director, and he says to me, "It's very nice to meet you." And I said, "What would you like us to do while we're here?" And he said, "I didn't know you were coming." This was an invitation from the chairman, who'd arranged everything. Hadn't bothered to tell the managing director of his airline that we were there. And
it's minor detail.
It's minor detail. No brief. And when I'd said to the chairman, well, I know there's a party that we were photographing, so we'll arrive on the Saturday, photograph the party on the Sunday, and presumably go home on the Monday. And he said, no, I'd like you to stay for a week, because at the end of the week, we're going to have our inaugural flight, and I want you to photograph that. And so in that week, I said to my colleagues, we can't just be here not doing anything. I will write a brief. And what I did was I created a brief that effectively would provide them with a set of photographs that they could use in a variety of ways that they would choose themselves. So I wasn't going to tell them what to do with them. But one day I saw these 5 aircraft that weren't in the position they're in now. They were parked up into bays. And I said to the MD, look, you're not flying at the moment for another few days. There's an idea that I've got, and it's a one-off. If you do it, it will be great. If you don't do it, you'll never have the opportunity to do it again.
Yeah.
And he said, "Oh, I like this idea," and I scribbled down some sketches on a piece of paper. He said, "I like this idea," and so to move those 5 planes into that position took about 3/4 of a day to get them into that position. It was a big, big job to do. And then all the people came out for the photograph. And of course, the thing about photography is that when everything's set up, you press the button and you go click, and you've taken the picture. So to be honest, I did take a few because
I was just thinking that.
Must take a few pictures, which I did. And I know that the pictures that I took, and I just show you one or two others. This was another photograph that I set up. Got the vans, the aircraft vans there, aligned with the aircraft, and it was a beautiful sunset. And so these were some of the photographs. Let's see if there's another one here. This one.
Oh, stunning.
These were, and this was in fact the chairman's private jet, because he bought this for himself before he opened the airline. And when people saw it and said, "Can we hire it?" he thought, "Hang on a minute, there's a business opportunity here." And so he then started to invest in the aircraft and developed the airline. And of course, Africa is not an easy place to work. This airline, when it was started in 2006, when he bought the aircraft and took them to Nigeria, it was the first time in 25 years that a new aircraft had been bought for Africa. So it was seen to be a major development. And he was producing an airline that would give a different level of service. That was the idea behind it. And so for me, this was very much an opportunity to provide them with things that they could use going forwards. And I know from going back 10 years later, in 2016, to repeat the job. But on that occasion, I went on my own, and I actually did many more photographs. And by that stage, I'm glad to say they did have a brief, and they kept me busy for that week. I really was busy all the time photographing. But again, it was creating library material, which was important for them.
Sure. Just looking at those the aircrafts, and when you said that, as we know in photography, it's all over in a click, and the amount of information and structure and thinking that goes into the background. I mean, I know one of the things that we wanted to cover was the advice on image development for a business. When it comes to entrepreneurs or businesses or organizations thinking about choosing those images, what advice have you got when it comes to putting that together so that they can have the right image that reflects the right message? Well, I guess
the starting point always has to be discussion, because one has to understand what it is that they want to achieve. And to be honest, my experience is that sometimes people, they very loosely know that they want to achieve something, but they actually don't know quite what it is that they want to achieve. And I had this on one occasion. I had to go and photograph a company chairman of a very successful company in just outside London. And their offices were they were actually based in what had been the hunting lodge of King Henry VIII, in the most beautiful stately home. And the man that I was going to photograph was the chairman of the company, and it was for his company report. And he had in mind exactly what he wanted. He knew what he wanted. And when I got there, and I was at Harrods at the time, and I turned up, and the first thing he said to me is, "We've already done this job once." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, we had a photographer here who didn't take any notice of, didn't listen to what I was telling him. And so the pictures that he created were not usable." And he said, "So I've had to start again." So what then happened was I took the photographs of him. I understood what he wanted. I took the photographs. I gave him another option. And he said, "I like that option." And we did those pictures as well. And when I went back to see him, this was interesting because he knew exactly what he needed. He looked at the two sets of, there were actually effectively two sets of pictures, and he looked at the first set and said, this is absolutely what I need, perfect. He looked at the second set and said, I like the second set very much indeed, but they're not right for my purpose. And the reason isn't, in the second set, I look like I've put a little bit of weight on. And the people, our investors, won't like that, because they'll look at the company report and they'd go, we're paying him too much money. He's put all this weight
Perception.
on. The perception was wrong, and he knew that. He knew exactly what he needed. He said, but this picture here, this group and this particular one, perfect for what I need. So I'd listened to what he needed. I created what he needed. I'd given him another option in case he preferred it. But in that case, he knew exactly what he wanted. Now, often people, what they're saying is, I need something that's going to work in this way. It might be pictures of them. It might be pictures of their staff. It might be a group picture. Equally, it might be something which incorporates other aspects of the business. And then it might not be people, or it might be people with those bits of the business. So it's a question of working out what people are trying to achieve. The benefit to taking, and I'm not a believer in taking lots of photographs, because that's not necessary. You don't take 20 pictures of the same thing, because if you're doing that, then it means you don't know which one is the right one, and you're taking 20 to hope that one of them is the right one. That's never the case. But you might take 20 different pictures because you're giving different options. They might be different angles, and they might be totally different pictures that present different opportunities for what for whatever they're intended. So that's it's one of those. It's an interesting thing, because I like having a brief. I like having that discussion to see, and then I have the ability, which is an important ability, but I can walk into an area, and as I walk into it, as I open a door and step into a room, I'm already looking at the angles and what I can take that's going to work, and what might need to be moved, and where the person may be positioned. And because actually the positioning of a person and their expression is the very last thing that's important. But seeing where the light's coming from is very important. It might be that there's a beautiful light coming through the window, and you don't need to put up extra lights, but you need to get the person in the right place to be photographed with that light within the setting, which is going to work not just for you as a photographer who says, haven't I created a great picture, but in a commercial opportunity and a corporate opportunity that works for them, for their need.
So let me flip that question on its head then, because I'm just thinking, what are the typical mistakes then that you would see that people should be aware of when thinking about putting together either their personal or their corporate picture?
Well, sometimes people might be wearing the wrong things. You don't want to wear things that are disturbing with the background and things like that, unless of course you're a designer and you wear the most bizarre, garish things and it's part of who you are. Then of course then you work with that, but then you might put them into the picture in a place where they don't conflict with what's behind them. So you don't want busy against busy necessarily. And there might even be occasions when you will do that, but it will depend on the overall thing of what you're trying to achieve. But obviously, when you're photographing somebody, you want them to look at their best. Now, I don't mean by that yes, you can retouch somebody, and someone says, and often, with ladies, they might say, look, I've got these lines under my eyes. You can take those lines away, but you don't want somebody to look. I never want somebody to look like somebody else. I don't want somebody to look at a picture of somebody and say, wow, that's a lovely picture. Who is it? And it's you. What's the point in that? You may as well cut a picture of Marilyn Monroe out of a magazine and put it in a frame and put it on your sideboard. There's no point in that. What I want to do is to make somebody look at their best. And the reason that sometimes you will use retouching is not because you're enhancing their looks, but lighting, quality lighting, can sometimes make lines appear where they're not really visible, but you're accentuating them. But if you flatten the lighting to get rid of those lines which are not normally there, then the picture can become flat. So as a photographer, you might have a contradiction in how you're working. You want strong lighting to create shape and form and to make the picture interesting, but you're creating a problem which you then have to get rid of afterwards, and that's not cheating, because that's working with the tools that you have.
That makes it's interesting that you say that, because that makes a lot of sense. Just looking at the last probably 60 to 80 years worth of photography in the typical glossy magazine type thing. And I've met in my life through the world of photography, ironically, many celebrities who, when I met them in real life, I wasn't sure who they were because they'd been touched up so much in magazines that the real person was very unlike the finished artwork that was produced in the end.
Well, it's really interesting that you say that, because I have a library of photographic books of photographers that I admire, and one of them is Cecil Beaton, who was a very famous English photographer. And Cecil Beaton, I think, did more photographs of the British royal family than any other photographer. Certainly way up there, if not the most, but I think he was the most. And there's a portrait in the book which shows the Queen's father as a elderly man at the very end of his life when he was ill. And the photograph of him, he looks like an elderly, ill man. But the portrait that was released by the palace, that was retouched beyond the level of retouching, he looks like a 21-year-old. And you look at these two pictures, and actually that's how they used to do certain things. Even with the royal portraits, they would only release them once they'd been doctored to a certain level. I don't think the royals would want that today. I think we've moved into a different sphere. Even in the world of advertising, of course, people and modelling, there are now magazines that say, and models and celebrities who say, I don't want to be seen as somebody that's unreal. I don't want to give the impression that I'm perfect, because I'm not perfect. I've got this, that, and the other. But the thing is that the one part of that I would add in is, if the lighting has caused something which makes you not look so good unnaturally, then I wouldn't have a problem with a bit of retouching to put it back where it should be.
Yeah, I think the way you put that so succinctly earlier, it was I've had many conversations about lighting and photography, but the way you put that in context just makes it so much simpler to understand. And I guess today the word that's being kind of knocked around quite heavily is the word authentic, and that's where what you just said with regards to not enhancing or changing the image, but potentially flattening it so that it is more reflective of the true image, is using the tools, as you say, that are available. One of the other things that you mentioned is the creation of images, and I'm conscious that if you look at the world that we live in now, which is heavily social media based, where so many people have the ability to be online, but so many people use absolutely awful pictures. And a common one on platforms like LinkedIn, as an example, is you'll see somebody who looks 20 years younger because they posted a picture of themselves in a suit 20 years ago. And then when you actually get to network or contact that person, it's almost like you feel a bit of a disconnect, because now you meet the person, you think, well, have you not updated your photo because you just don't have access to a camera, or is it because you're trying to reflect a different image to who you really are? Or So what are your thoughts about
Well,
that?
there's actually, yeah, I think is a bit of a two-sided coin actually, because firstly, understandably, people want to look good, but they don't necessarily know what that means. In fact, they generally don't know what that means. So, and I have to throw into the mix here that it's something which is very, very important and people don't always appreciate, and that is that when we look in the mirror and we see our own image, generally we don't like the way we look. We would all like to look better or different in some way. That's the first thing. When you hear your voice played back, it's even worse. I can't possibly sound like that. So that's the image thing, and the voice is the same thing, but the image thing is very, very important. So you look at yourself, and we are the worst to judge our own image because, in general, we don't like the way we look. Yeah. So that's the first thing. The second thing is how you use your image. Now, sometimes people today, they'll put images out on social media that actually they wouldn't want to be shared. We know that there have been occasions where businesses, I mean, very simplistic thing. Somebody phones in work and says, I'm sick, I need a week off. And then they post onto a site a picture of them on the beach in Spain, and then they lose their job.
Yeah.
Because those two things don't go together. And when you're putting stuff out there, whether it's something you say or something that you show, it may be something that you will say or show to your friend who's not going to repeat it, but you don't want to show to the whole world. And social media, once you put something out there in social media, it can go anywhere and you have no control over it.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. That's an important factor. The second thing is coming back to the actual image itself. You know, how do you want to look? How do you want to portray yourself? Well, I think that you could almost, there is an element that says, well, if you're showing a picture of yourself 20 years ago, but actually that's not you today, and you look really quite different, there's some people could see that as quite deceptive in a way. Some people might not like that because you're not being honest about this is who I am. And actually, you take me as I am and you take me or leave me. You know, that's it. So therefore, when you have an image that you want to portray, it can be very much something where you need to show something which is going to work for you. So in fact, if I just go back to, let me just go back to one of the images I showed you just now on my, so if I go into this one, and okay, so if I, hopefully I can share this with you. I know it's always a problem the first time I do this. Has that taken over your whole screen or not?
It says you have started screen sharing, but it didn't show anything else.
So let's do it again, and hopefully this time it will bring up what we need. Okay, so that now should give you a full screen of...
It does.
Right. And that's a pop singer called Alvin Starkdust. I don't know if you remember Alvin Starkdust.
I do indeed.
This was taken in my studio, and this was really just, the idea was to create a set of images that would be, again, usable in different ways. Alvin was a very, very good musician. I have to say his kind of music is not my kind of music, but I could recognize his musical ability. He was very competent. The funny thing was, when he came to my studio, he phoned me a few days before and said, you know, I've always wanted to be photographed with a Harley Davidson motorbike. And I said, okay, not knowing really what I was going to do about that, because I didn't have a Harley Davidson motorbike. So
we'll get one into your studio.
I couldn't get one into the studio anyway. Even if we got one, I couldn't get into the studio. So anyway, I phoned up Harley Davidson and I said, I'm photographing Alvin Starkdust, and he loves your motorbikes. And they said to me, where would you like it delivered, sir? And sure enough, a truck turned up a few days later when he was with me, and out came this beautiful Harley Davidson motorbike, and I took him somewhere locally where we could do some photographs. So this was one that was in my studio, and I'm just going to go to another portrait. So
just get up and go. I mean, that picture just says so much.
And this is my friend Larry Adler.
which I'd like to come on to next. Yes.
We'll come on to him in a minute. And then this one here, this was Lord Shimwell. Lord Shimwell, Manny Shimwell, was 101 when I took this portrait. And he was really one of the most fascinating people I photographed. And this was, I didn't need a setting with this. This was just about the man who had an incredible history. And then the famous Ronnie Scott, you know, the jazz musician.
Wow.
This is in Ronnie Scott's jazz club, and this was in his office, and behind him he had various images on the wall. And here he was just cradling his saxophone. It's an image.
I love the fact that it's not just a polished brand new saxophone for image quality. It's actually one that tells the story of the time played.
Yeah, and he's kind of cuddling it. You know, he's not playing it. Yeah. This is a portrait, and he's holding it, and I love the way that he's positioned there. This is Lord Sir Klaus Moser. This was at the Royal Opera House, and I arrived at the Royal Opera House with my wife as well. And the room that I'm actually standing in is the room that I'm looking through the doors out of. The room is the room that belongs to the royal family when they visit the Royal Opera House.
Oh, wow.
And Klaus Moser was the chairman of the Opera House at that point, and I loved the setting. The room actually wasn't anything particularly special, but this setting was lovely. And when he arrived, he said to me, I'm late. I'm sorry I'm late, and I've got a meeting in 5 minutes. You've got 5 minutes. And actually, I'd planned the shot. I knew exactly what I wanted. And within a minute, I'd done what I needed, because everything was ready. I didn't have to, I was there early. Everything was set up. I'd worked out what I wanted. I worked out the shot. And then this one, in fact, was...
I just love especially the positioning with the mirror in the background where you've got that...
With him in it as well.
Yeah.
And then here is Lord Seif, who at the time was chairman of Marks and Spencer, president of Marks and Spencer. And when I arrived at Marks and Spencer to do this, and I walked in and I said, I'm here to see Lord Seif, there was a hushed silence in the region where I was standing. And one of the receptionists turned to another one and said, he's here to see the president. And I felt like I'd just arrived at the White House, and I was quite daunted by this. But actually, Lord Seif was extremely charming. And when he saw the portrait, and again, this is all film that was shot on, about a week or so later, he saw the portrait. He said, I love what you've done. You must photograph my wife. And I then went to their London home, and I did this portrait of Lady Seif.
Stunning.
And it tells a story, the portrait is very balanced. I wanted, everything is very clinical in the way that I've laid it out in terms of the cropping, so that the two
and the lines
are, and the lines and so on. And she's a part of that portrait. She's not in the middle. And there's a beautiful, it's probably, I don't know if it's a Cézanne on the wall or something, but this is, and then I can just show you, I think I've got one or two others. This was Lord Weidenfeld, who I mentioned, in his London home. Amazing place.
It looks like such almost like a typical mafia kind of look to it, where there's authority in the picture. The composition is brilliant.
And in fact, I photographed him when he was 65 when I took this portrait, and I photographed him again when he was 95 in the same setting, but differently. In fact, I did one portrait in the same, not the same position, but on the same settee, but some others which are different. And again, when I went to see him afterwards, and that was digital, but I went to see him a few days later, and I took my laptop and I showed him the portraits, and he said, I have to call my staff in because these are the best portraits ever taken of me, which was fantastic.
That's a compliment on its own.
Was a great compliment. So that just gives you an idea of some of those, those people that I photographed. And of course, I mentioned Larry, who was really, I mentioned earlier on that he was somebody that I knew the name of. And of all the people I've worked with over the years, he was one person I really, really wanted to photograph and just to spend a little bit of time with. It was just, for me, that was, even though at that point I didn't play the harmonica, I hadn't, when I met Larry in 1995, I hadn't played the harmonica at that point for probably 30 plus years.
Wow.
But it still was significant. He was significant as a personality. And when I knew him over the next 6 years, that because he was already 82 when I met him, over the next 5 years, and he died when he was 87. And during that time, the idea that I'd play a harmonica or even try a harmonica, it actually didn't even occur to me. You know, it wasn't important to me at that time. It was only, again, some years later that I suddenly thought, actually, you know, I think I'd be quite interested to see if I can still play the harmonica, and would it mean anything to me? And the harmonicas I had, which were now, you know, 40 years old or older, really weren't any good. You know, they've got a bit of a shelf life. They're not terribly expensive pieces of equipment to buy, instruments to buy. So I had to go out and buy one, which I did, and then I sort of took it out of the box and, oh yeah, I can still play because I had all that musical history behind me. And so I then started to get a little bit interested, and that interest for me has grown enormously, to the point now that I'm actually doing some recordings with the idea of putting together an album. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that is, you know, just looking at that full circle, because, you know, starting with, you know, you mentioned and showed us the harmonica that you got at the age of 9 that your dad presented to you. Did Larry ever get to see that? Did you ever tell him the story?
I did tell him the story, yes. I never showed him that particular. I never took it to show him, but I told him the story, and I know that he was very amused by that happening. And the way that I met Larry was that in 1995 was when I was going to move into Harrods. I actually opened the business, and I had a contact who I'd met, who was at that time the international president of the Variety Club. And the Variety Club, or Variety as it's known now, is an organization that works with celebrities in the world of entertainment.
Yep.
And they do a lot of things for charity. And they had a charity event that was going to be held at the Dorchester Hotel in Park Lane. And John Ratcliffe, who was the international president, said to me, I'd like you and your wife to come as my guests for lunch, because Larry's going to be there and I can introduce you. And I said, wow, that would be, you know, fantastic. So here we are. We turn up at this fabulous hotel, and we walk into the ballroom, and you look around, and every face is a face that you recognize. And actually, there were so many people there. There were people you couldn't see, and the guest of honor at the event was actually Christian Barnard, the heart specialist,
who was the first person I did the photography archiving for at the age of 13,
which is amazing. What an amazing coincidence. And they were actually celebrating the life of a comedian who very well known in his day, called Davy Kay. But Davy Kay actually at a certain point stopped doing comedy things and just did stuff for charity. So he disappeared from the sort of everyday, well-known thing. People in the industry, of course, would know instantly who he was. This lunch was for him, and Christian Barnard was one of his close friends, and he'd come specially from South Africa to be at this presentation and to speak. And then in the middle of this, at the lunch, the lights went down, and I suddenly heard this amazing harmonica playing. And Larry was playing with an orchestral background, which was obviously a recording. And then at the end of lunch, I was told Larry's, you know, about to leave, and I was whisked over to meet him. And we chatted for literally a few seconds, and he said, "Here's my phone number, call me." And the next day I phoned him, and he said, Are you busy? Can you come for coffee? And I said, well, I can, but I don't know where you live. I mean, he could have been living anywhere in the UK. And it turned out that he lived at that point about 3 minutes walk from where I was standing when I made the phone call.
Wow.
So within, you know, literally 10 minutes later, there I am in his flat, sitting, chatting to him. And we just hit it off, and and I didn't have any expectations that anything more. I knew he was going to come to my studio for me to photograph him, but I had no expectation of anything beyond that. And then he would call me and say, I'm giving a concert tonight, why don't you come along and bring your camera, maybe take a few pictures, and let's go for lunch, and etc., etc. And so we just became friends. And eventually, within the last couple of years of his life, I introduced him to a big charity that I was involved with for children. Funnily enough, we used to do our major event of the year at the Dorchester, in the same room that I first met him.
Wow.
And he came to one of those events, and that's quite a story in itself. The interesting thing was that when he came to the event, he'd had an accident, and he was 86, and he was very doddery, and he didn't look great. And the suggestion was that he wouldn't do anything, but he got very annoyed with me and said, I came here specially to do something. And he said, I came here to play the harmonica, and that's what I'm going to do. And I discovered afterwards that before he started playing the harmonica, the people that would normally put their hands in their pockets hadn't. And when he put the harmonica down 3-4 minutes later, we raised £140,000. Yeah. And there was no question that Larry's contribution to that evening was just staggering. Yeah. Yeah.
Sure. I've got...
Yeah, it was something that I will never forget. There wasn't a dry eye in the house that night, the way he played. And there was no backing. It was just a harmonica on its own. It was quite magical, I have to say. Yeah. Yeah. And one thing I might just tell you and just show you is that there are different types of harmonicas. I've got one here which is known as the Blues Harmonica. This is a very little one. A very very much a starting one, which I don't actually play personally, which is this one here, very tiny, as you can see. I actually have another one here which is even tinier, and this one is very special because it's got Larry's name on the box, and inside this box is actually
that's the box.
That's the box. That's the harmonica.
Wow.
And this harmonica, which is like this bigger one, which I don't play, but I do play this to demonstrate that this is a real harmonica.
Oh, wow.
And those were made for Larry Adler as gifts. He would give those out to people. So that was very, very special. But the one that Larry played was a harmonica called the Chromatic. And the thing about the Chromatic harmonica is it has this little button on the side, which you press in. And when you press it in and out, the different holes open and close, and so you're producing different sounds. And you can't do this sound on a diatonic, on the blues harmonica, because it doesn't have the facility. But with this harmonica, I can... You can't do that on a diatonic because there isn't the facility to do it. But it means that with this kind of harmonica, what I love about it is that you can produce very rich sounds if you can, because the thing is that you're directing sound into air, in fact, into these small holes, and that's not easy, because a lot of people, when they try and play the harmonica, what happens is what they get is that, which is easy because you're just blowing into a lot of holes. But to actually get something that sounds like a piece of music, where you direct the air only into the holes that you want. So if I wanted to play something like... and so on, that's where, for me, this instrument becomes very special, because I can do things with this that I couldn't do with the blues harmonica. And the kind of music that you play on a blues harmonica is not the kind of music that interests me, whereas the Chromatic allows me to do, for me, the kind of music that I like to play.
Oh, and I know I spoke to you about this previously, about the impact of music and the power of using music to bring people together. And you spoke about doing events or corporate kind of bonding sessions where you can bring people together using music. And I just thought it was a beautiful way of potentially getting people to let down their hair as such, but experience something that is so different. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and in fact, actually, something which we didn't discuss when we talked about that previously was the fact that Larry Adler's story is very not just emotional, but it's very inspirational, because Larry faced all sorts of issues in his life, one of which was that he was blacklisted in the McCarthy period and couldn't continue to live in America where he was born and where he'd lived his first sort of 35 years of his life, or 30 years of his life, because he reached a stage where he was blacklisted and couldn't work. And at that point, Larry was one of the highest paid performers in the States. He worked with everybody. And I mean, when I say everybody, I mean people like Chaplin, Greta Garbo, Salvador Dali, Gene Kelly, Fred Astaire, any name that you can think of, Frank Sinatra, all of these people were his colleagues and his friends. And he worked with those people. And then the blacklisting came about. And because of the belief that he might have communist tendencies, he couldn't continue to work there. And Larry, who was a spindly little man, but had very strong beliefs, his view was, whatever I am is my business and not somebody else's. And I'm not going to say what I am or I'm not, even if it means I can't work, even if it means I can't continue to live in this country. And that's what happened. So he then left.
So for his freedom of speech, he got blacklisted.
And then he had to come and live in the UK, where the view was that there is no issue with you, whatever your belief is, you can come and work here. And he came here in the late 30s, and he then went on to become internationally known in a much bigger way than he probably would have been if he remained in the States, because he then traveled regularly to places like Japan and Australia and South Africa and so on and so forth. And it changed the way that he was viewed worldwide. And so in talking about what you can do with a company when you get a group of people together and you give them a little harmonica like this to have some fun with, the story about Larry is what is entwined with all of this and can be very fascinating. So people can have some fun, but there can also be some very interesting discussion and ideas about how you can take something that you might look at and go, I don't think I can achieve that. Well, Larry's view was, which is my view, is that if you don't try, you never will achieve it. But why should you not achieve it? And so that is a very important aspect of the whole thing. And actually, with one of these instruments, which are not expensive, and everyone has to have their own instrument for a project like that, because for hygiene reasons and nothing to do with the current virus. But you can't pass these things around. It's yours. You have it.
Yeah, you don't want to be sharing everybody's saliva.
You certainly can't do that. So you each have your own little harmonica, and you'll have some fun with it. And the fun will depend, or how involved that fun will depend entirely on how much time and effort you want to put into it. But by the end of a session, I'll have you playing something. That's the aim.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
And when you say at the end of the session, how long does the session have to be?
An hour.
Like a week?
No, an hour.
So within an hour, you'll have somebody playing something.
I'll have somebody. I would think that most people would be playing something. Yeah. That's my experience. Has been teaching a group of people, and at the end of it, in fact, actually, staggering to me that they've gone further than I had anticipated that they would achieve. Obviously, if somebody's already got some musical ability, it might be a bit easier for them. But generally, people will achieve something that they'll be quite happy with at the end of an hour. Yeah. And if you've got longer, of course, then you can do more things, but not just with the harmonica. The harmonica becomes kind of the tool that you're working with, but there's the opportunity for groups, for discussions about various aspects of whatever. looking at what people are doing in their own work and in their own lives, and how maybe they will approach it. Maybe they're doing something one way, and they might want to just throw that out and say, well, if this is what I'm doing, but if I did this instead, or if I approach it like this, what do how might that work? And that discussion can be very rewarding, because it's kind of networking, but even beyond that.
I can see that as a great disruptive tool to disrupt the everyday mundane and the typical kind of team building exercises that most people kind of roll their eyes or really don't want to show up to, because they kind of cringy. I could see that as a real fun way of doing things, but combine that with the iconic story of Larry Adler, and the fact that you've written this book that encompasses his life and has so many phenomenal people that have contributed to it.
Well, I might just add to that the thing with Larry was that what we discovered was that we had quite a lot of things in common. So Larry's passion was in fact tennis, and my passion has been tennis for most of my life, apart from music and photography. And here's Larry, world famous musician, but every day that he could, he would play tennis. And in fact, the thing about that is that when I wrote the book, I wanted to write the book from the perspective of how my life was involved with Larry. So it's, Larry had written his own book about his life, so I didn't want to just rewrite that book. That would have been pointless. But it was my tribute to Larry. And then I thought, well, actually, it would be great to invite others to contribute to it. And so I started to contact people to contribute, and people like Sting and Cher and Sir George Martin and Sir Michael Parkinson and Peter Stringfellow and so on, they all contributed to the book. The funny thing was that after I started writing the book, and it took quite a time, because I don't really consider myself to be an author. I mean, I'm an author because I'm a published author, but whereas some people, that's their job, my job is not as an author as such. And so it took me quite some time, and also to actually develop the process was difficult. And at one particular point, a friend of mine who I met at university, studying, doing our specialist music course, phoned me one day and said, "We're going to the Albert Hall tonight. It's the Classic FM Awards, and you're my guest, and we're gonna meet there." So we turn up at the Classic FM Awards, and we're sitting in the audience of the Albert Hall, which is a magnificent place. And he said to me, "How's the book going?" And I said, "Well, it's going okay." But I said, it's very difficult to contact people, because how do you get in touch with someone like Sting? I want him to write for the book, but how do you make the contact? And he said to me, "Well, yeah," he said, of course, it's really difficult. Come the break, he said, "Come on, let's go and get a drink." We walk into the corridor, and I am not joking when I say that Sting was standing in the corridor.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing how destiny...
Nobody else. I mean, Sting was there with his minder, but nobody else. So we walked into the corridor, and he just walked past us, and I ran up to him and said, "I must introduce myself. This is who I am. This is what I'm doing." And he said, "Of course I'll write something." And actually, it was sometime later that I had to reconnect with him. By that time, I was able to do it through his agent. Through the internet, it was easier to make the contact.
For sure.
But nevertheless, these things just
it already broken that barrier because of the personal.
Yeah, and his contribution, in fact, was a very funny one, and refers to Larry and tennis and how they met and so on. And so it's a fascinating story. Yeah.
Wow, Gary, I'm conscious that we've taken up so much of your time, and we've gone and learnt. I feel like we've only scratched the surface. But so many things, from the photography side of things, and how we can look at images, and also the music side of things, and how to bring all that together. It is you've got a phenomenal story to tell, and I believe any company or organization that has the opportunity should have you in to not only share the story, but get that harmonica out and get the hair on your arms.
Well, it's a funny thing, because when I finished the book, and people then started coming to me and saying, "Will you come and talk to us about the book?" And it then started to develop into a guest speaking slot. And I thought, well, I'm talking about the book, but actually the book is not my work. My work is as a photographer, and I've got lots of stories about my work as a photographer, and I've got other things I can talk about, because actually, I won't go into detail here, but I did a project about the Steinway piano and why it takes a year to build a Steinway piano. And that's a fascinating talk. And I spent 2 days in the Steinway factory photographing the process of all the developments of the piano. And when I give the talk, I show those images and talk through why it takes a year. And I was very fortunate in the days when I was a student to actually have a Steinway piano for a few years, Steinway grand piano, a small grand piano.
Wow.
And that was what interested me to take that project further. And so, it led to me becoming a guest speaker. It led to me being invited to talk on cruise ships. And the funny thing was, when I went for my audition to talk on cruise ships, and I had to stand up in front of a room of people that book people to talk on cruise ships. They're all sitting there, and I'm going through my bit and pieces. And then at a certain point, I think about 10 minutes into the process, I said, I'd like to just show you this. And I brought out the harmonica and I started to play it. And I could see people's eyes light up in the room. And the next thing was, not immediately, but a week later, I got a phone call to say, we'd like to book you for your first cruise. And so that's been absolutely fascinating. And I've really enjoyed that up to now, because at the moment everything's on hold for so many things. But hopefully that will come back. But I love the guest speaking, because I have got a lot of stuff to talk about, and because I'm a visual person, and because I work visually, when I talk, I've always got a lot of images to show, which means that people are kind of captivated by what they're seeing, and they're not just listening to somebody talking, but they're also seeing a lot of things on a screen, and of course that makes it easier to present, but hopefully, all I can say is, and I'm not blowing my own trumpet or blowing the harmonica, but I see the reaction I get to the talks and know that they go down well. So that's great.
Excellent stuff. So tell us, if somebody wanted to reach out to you, what is the best way to communicate with you? Is it a phone call? Is it through an agent? Is it through your website?
Yeah. So I don't have an agent apart from my cruise ship things, but that's direct the agent with a cruise ship, cruise ships. But no, generally people can either go to my website, which is simply Italiaander with the correct spelling.co.uk. And my phone number and my email is on there. They can contact me directly with an email, which is Gary, Gary, only one R, at italiaander.co.uk. And my phone number is on the website, and I'm happy for people to contact me any way they want, and of course through you if they can't reach me through any other route.
Excellent stuff. So I'll make sure that all your contact information and links to various bits that we've spoken about today is available in the description of this video, in all the places that we're going to be sharing it. I really would suggest that people reach out to Gary, connect, have a conversation. You never know where that will go. But I'm sure you'll be fascinated as I was, to see where that conversation goes, and who knows what the future holds there. So Gary, thank you so much for sharing your wealth of knowledge, your time, and your.
I really enjoy
insane speakers.
And I really enjoy being able to share with people and help them to develop what it is that they want to develop. I've got all this experience, and it's great to put it into practice.
Excellent stuff. Well, Gary, thank you so much for taking the time today. And I look forward to seeing where this conversation leads, and who connects and what the world has to see through the eyes of Gary Italiaander. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I've enjoyed it very much, and I've no doubt we will talk again soon.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.